Says you're being live screened on YouTube.
Yeah, I just set that.
My dogs have apparently found something fascinating to bark at. So Mike, anyways, a quick catch up here after the SEC issue. By the way, I really liked your comments.
Oh, good. Thank you.
You did a great job. It was really well done. There is a lot evolving in Europe with the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board.
SASB, yeah.
Yes. And they published back in March or so, right around the time the SEC opened up for comments.
Yeah.
They published some advisory document, which was a suggestion for the EU, who's going through the sustainability record keeping adoption, let's call it regulation adoption process. And we haven't seen the final results of that, but it looks like they've adopted this this practice called double materiality.
Is that the notion of that there is both a raw economic materiality and a sort of a social materiality as well, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, it's a bit of reciprocity on the social materiality. So it's not just how is it, which we're familiar with, how is climate impacting your operations, but it's also how are your operations impacting climate.
Right.
So
good.
A lot of strong wording.
Yeah, if you have anything on that, I'm happy to see it.
Yeah, I do. I'm happy to share it. GRI is putting out a ton of information almost daily. And I'll definitely send it to you.
I don't think this panelist business worked.
What's that?
I'm still not able to get my image on.
Fran, I don't know what it is, and unfortunately, can't fix that right now.
I try to, yeah. I don't want to mess around with it too much because I don't want to knock you out, Ted.
Well, thanks, Ray. Let me take a look and see if I can edit it really quick.
Okay, it said unable to start video because host has stopped it.
Well, I'm certainly not stopping it. Nothing would please me more, but let's take a look. I don't think it's going to let me edit. Yeah, it's not letting me edit an active webinar.
Try now.
You've got 8 participants waiting to be invited.
To be let in.
It says everybody's in.
Okay.
On the right side. This is a little different than the meetings platform. This is the webinar platform. That's why it's got a few extra edit functions in it. We're gonna open it up and make sure everybody can talk. You can mute yourself. And my apologies to Mike and Fran for.
Fran, I made you a host, Fran, so.
It doesn't seem to matter.
Yeah. Well, let's get started.
Oh, it does. No, it's not showing Fran's. All right, let's get
I'm
started.
not saying you now. Oh,
Well,
I see you on YouTube.
I'm here.
Okay.
All right, so let's get started. We do these talks or discussions from time to time. I think we owe Stephanie a big thank you. She's unable to be here today. She's doing her study abroad program in Milan, and it's 1 a.m, so a little bit late, even for a late night European opportunity to talk. But we certainly do appreciate all the work that Stephanie did throughout the summer. She called a lot of different groups. She really took a serious interest in refrigerant, and she's the reason we're here today. We get a chance to talk about refrigerants. Ray, you want to run the show and make the introductions? Hold on, let me get things started.
Certainly, I'll let everyone introduce themselves. My name's Ray Bouchard. I'm one of the refrigerant geeks at TrackRef and handle a lot of the communication aspects. And that's why we put this thing together tonight, to send out the message to people who can actually take action and change things in the world, as you'll see through the slides that we're about to show you. Fran, why don't you introduce yourself? They don't really need to hear from me too much.
My name is Francis Custer. I have a doctorate from the Program for the Study of the Future at the University of Massachusetts, where I studied the future of the basic life support systems of air, water, food, and fuel. I was an early pioneer in solar and wind energy and ran President Carter's largest solar program. After he got fired, so did I. And I wrote some articles about the future of the environment's impact on health and got hired to become a pediatric healthcare administrator, where I spent the majority of my working career, and was an early pioneer in telemedicine, electronic medical records, geo-mapping of disease clusters and things like that. I retired 12 years ago. I've written a couple books on local self-improvement and sustainability. And now I run a program called the Pollution Detectives, which loans out equipment to citizen vigilantes to make the invisible visible.
That's great. Thank you so much. And thank you for all your work in this area for, well, what, about 50 years almost, really.
Yes.
That's what they call OG. Steve, are you there? Apparently not.
Let's just jump right to Mike and then get into the discussion.
Very good. Mike, are you there?
Yes, great. Can you hear me?
Okay, absolutely. Go ahead.
So good. So Fran, I wonder if you were the one who put the solar panels on the White House in the Carter administration that Reagan then took off of the White House. That's a famous move.
No, I wasn't involved in that. I worked at the Tennessee Valley Authority, where 1,000 solar systems were put in the city of Memphis. And then political forces intervened.
Interesting. So I'm familiar with that phenomenon. So I'm Mike Vandenberg. I'm a professor at the Vanderbilt Law School, and I co-direct our Energy, Environment, and Land Use program and the Climate Change Research Network, which is an informal network of social and behavioral scientists around the world who focus on individual and household behavior and what the private sector can do. And I've served as the EPA Chief of Staff during the Clinton administration, and as a partner at Latham & Watkins, which is a large global law firm, before coming into teaching. And I have a book out called Beyond Politics, the Private Governance Response to Climate Change, with Vanderbilt physicist Jonathan Gilligan. The focus of that book is really something very relevant to what we're talking about today, which is, given the deep polarization that we see at the federal level and in many states, that we need to be looking for alternatives to the silver bullet federal legislative solutions across the board on climate. And I think one of the things Ted will talk to us about tonight is the success that occurred with focusing on refrigerants in Congress. One of the few successes recently occurred last year. We want to hear more about that today, but I think we're going to need that in a range of different areas. So much of my work right now is focusing on bypassing political polarization to try to buy time on climate change. And refrigerants are a huge piece of the opportunity out there. And I was privileged to be able to publish an article with Ted and with one of our students a few years ago, where we focused on what the private sector can do about refrigerants. And happy to talk more about that as we go forward.
Yeah, and Mike, I feel like we're lucky to have you here. I know how busy you are this semester. And in addition to your book, I know about all the regular academic work that's piling up. So thanks for spending the time with us.
Yeah,
I appreciate that. And we have some of my students here on the call too. So it's good to have them in the audience. I appreciate their attendance here.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. We'll
Yeah,
have more
and
people
Steve-
coming in and out, but
Yes, Steve
ahead.
Dauphin is our hidden in the background anonymous person. And one of the things we like to talk about in every one of these discussions is the collective you. This isn't really about us. This is about a topic that's solvable, has a really interesting legacy, and it has an enormous amount of impact. Anybody on the call who is not familiar with Project Drawdown, we're happy to dig into the discussion. The refrigerants were ranked as the #1 solution to solve the climate challenge by Project Drawdown. And when Paul was guiding this book through its research, he did not want refrigerants to be the #1 topic. And I've been in probably a dozen Paul Hawken webinars over the last 4 years or 3.5 years, and he'll talk about it. He wanted it to be something more interesting, something that had a bigger, broader appeal. But no matter how hard they worked to find something that was bigger than refrigerants, the sheer magnitude of refrigerants' impact continued to push itself to the top of the list. And you can see here, this is the 2017 version of that report. The 2019 or 2020, I think it was 2019, published version of this report breaks refrigerants up into 2 groups. And it does cut refrigerants in half. But when you add those 2 halves back up, refrigerants again rise to the top. And what they did is they broke it down into 2 categories.
Ed, we're not seeing your screen. I don't know if you're sharing it, but I'm not seeing it.
It says I am.
Nope.
Let's try it again.
There we go.
Can you see it now?
Solutions by rank.
Okay, great. Hold on. All right, fantastic. So, anyway, so refrigerants, I won't repeat what I just said, but this is a placeholder for the thought process, 89.74 gigatons. And that number is conservative. A couple of different organizations have done additional studies, and they've come up with larger numbers.
Ed, can I break in with just one thought that I think is particularly important here as you go through?
Sure.
The challenges of the Project Drawdown approach is it didn't explicitly examine the feasibility of achieving the reductions it identified. It's essentially a technical potential focus. What if we could get everyone to do everything, what would it be?
Yeah.
And I think what makes the refrigerant opportunity so attractive is even though that wasn't an explicit component of the analysis, at least as revealed in the reports that I've read, it nevertheless is true about refrigerants. So refrigerants are not only a huge opportunity if everyone will change behavior on refrigerants, but there's a real opportunity to do so because it's often in the financial interests of the institutions and individuals who would want to reduce refrigerants. So I think it meets even another criterion over and above what was explicitly evaluated in the Project Drawdown effort.
No, it's a great point. I appreciate you pointing it out. Even the representation of the savings, that it was going to be a cost center, doesn't really represent the true impact of refrigerants. Doesn't talk about the energy savings, the maintenance savings, or even the material savings. And to call this number out a little bit more, the appeal of electric vehicles, which is really a lot more interesting on media than refrigerant management, pale in comparison to refrigerant management. So it's significant. Why is it significant? Because the global warming potential for these materials is magnificently huge. I don't know how to pass this along any better than the numbers that were recently put out by the IPCC AR6 report that was just published in August. The 100-year, let's call it depreciation for destruction of these materials. They don't all survive in the atmosphere. They're referred to for long periods of time. They're referred to as SLCPs, short-lived climate pollutants, and they're huge. A material like 404 will only last about 11 years. So its 100-year life cycle GWP is 3936, but its 20-year GWP is 7200. Now, because most of these materials won't live for 100 years, international treaties have established the 100-year ranking to compare and benchmark all these materials. So you won't see these 20-year numbers popping up in any reports anytime soon, unless you're looking at research reports on real physical impact. But you get an idea from these numbers, and these numbers are constantly under review. But this latest review did a really nice job of taking into account the radiative impact of each material. And the study in the troposphere is very, very hard to manage. So they had to do this in a much more controlled environment. And it took about 5 years for these numbers to make their way through the research process. But if you take a look, this is why refrigerants are so impactful towards global warming, and why they represent such a large amount of opportunity once we apply some better management practices. For instance, in this case, HCFC 22, which is incredibly common, it's about 50% of the installed base in the US today. Its 20-year life is roughly nearly 3 tons. Let's round it. But otherwise, it's just under 1 ton for its impact. So
Fran had a question about why are savings negative?
When Project Drawdown did their research, they were only doing it based on the cost to change out materials. They didn't do any, as Michael was explaining, they don't do any cost benefit analysis on this segment, because there was no real market information for them to refer back to.
Very good.
All right, so these numbers are huge. But anyone have any questions on these numbers? Because they really are substantial. Even the new refrigerants, the next generation of refrigerants, these R448 and 449s, you'll see their 100-year gets them below what we like to think of as a friendly 1,500 GWP. That's considered the friendly number. But when you look at the 20-year impact of these materials, you're still at 1.5 tons of carbon per pound of refrigerant. Now, when these are all added up, we vent in the United States roughly 600 million pounds. So you take these numbers, you break them out into their total weighted percent of the market, and then you realize that we have 600 million pounds of these dumping into the atmosphere annually. This is the passenger air travel emissions in the United States, which is approximately 179 million metric tons. And what it comes away with is the combination of all passenger air travel from China, the EU, and the United States does not equal the CO2 emissions from refrigerants. So it's a really big number.
If anyone does have questions, just you can put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, this is really, really big. It's very impactful. I'll get onto the good news in a minute, but for 27 years, we've been watching these numbers continue to grow. So the Montreal Protocol was assumed to put controls on emissions of refrigerants. The problem with the Montreal Protocol is it was really a treaty about replacing old refrigerants with new refrigerants. And the EPA has established that ultimately all refrigerants in the US are vented. And that's a real easy set of calculus to do, because if the materials are not destroyed, then they are vented. And we don't have enough destruction facilities in the US to facilitate destroying all of these refrigerants. And so really we're talking about millions of pounds of refrigerants that are destroyed every year. But those are primarily for carbon offset credits. And the remainder of that material is vented. There wasn't an AIM Act. I love to talk about this. This is probably one of the best bipartisan bills ever signed. It was signed in December under the Trump administration. And I also like to point out that many of the climate-related refrigerant bills and many of the refrigerant controls that have been put in place have been signed into law during Republican administrations. This one was fascinating. Let me tell you what it does first. It limits the sale of refrigerant. It gives the EPA control over some of the maintenance on refrigerants. Believe it or not, the EPA, their authority is fairly limited in what they can do and not do. And a lot of this has been worked out in the courts. But the EPA was given some more authority over maintenance in the AIM Act. One of the big wins is the elimination of disposable cylinders. Here in the US, most of our refrigerant is traded, bought and sold in disposable cylinders. Those disposable cylinders commonly have a heel of anywhere from 2 to 3 pounds in every cylinder. And we process right around, I think the number is 20 million or 17 million cylinders a year. So as you can imagine, roughly 40 to 50 million pounds of refrigerants are vented just through heels that are left in cylinders. One of the things you may not know is that most of your fire suppressants in buildings are refrigerant-based propellants as well. One of the big losses is semiconductors. Most semiconductors are made with fluorinated compounds, and in the fab process of producing a semiconductor wafer, that refrigerant is used as an etchant in the fabrication process, and it's all vented. There are some destruction technologies that are mounted near these etching cabinets, but there's really very little control over those, and anything that's there is voluntary. And so those are not part of that 600 million pounds. But the fire suppression and all the climate control related uses for refrigerants are. Now, the bill, I got to watch this come through. And the AIM Act it's referred to as the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act. And I think it was 2018 when it was first floated as an option. It had very strong bipartisan support. Tom Carper out of Delaware and a really interesting, vibrant Senator Kennedy out of Louisiana. No relation, as far as I know, to the Kennedy family in Massachusetts. But he's a real interesting character. And it's obvious that Delaware and Louisiana share a heavy industrial base in refrigerants. And so I'll give you the abbreviated version of the story. The Republicans realized that the Democrats were about to take over the House. Senator Barrasso was very worried about the Green New Deal. And as a result, he wanted to get a refrigerant bill or some type of sustainability bill out through, this bill comes through the energy and I forget what the rest of the committee's called in the Senate. But anyways, it had to go through him. And he was so frustrated with the fact that the state of California was putting their own rules in place, so worried about the Green New Deal, that he rushed this bill into the COVID relief funding bill that went to President Trump's desk on December 23rd, 2020. And they didn't really have a chance to look through too many of the details because the bill had been rejected so many times by Senator Barrasso. But as we got closer and closer, the committees had to come together pretty quickly. So the House version of this bill is what really made it into the COVID relief funding bill. So both sides of the aisle found a way to get along. It's very surprising to me that it happened the way it did, but it was also very exciting because we've waited 27 years to see this level of authority be given to the EPA. We've known about the GWP impact factors on these refrigerants ever since they were put into the marketplace. And whether it was old school politics or fear, the bill got pushed through, and now the EPA has lots of new authority. And the phase down that you see here in the chart is already in place. This was published a week ago yesterday.
And this is maybe another chance for me just to make a point for the students in the audience that, this is a great topic to do a paper on. We haven't seen major new federal legislation since the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. We've seen occasional rifle shot bills like this one. And I think it's a great political economy story and a bypassing polarization story. It'd be fascinating if you're, an undergraduate political science major or a law student or a business student to examine why did this bill pass and what does that tell us about the likelihood of other climate-related legislation passing in the future?
You bring up a really valid point. Sometimes we get so caught up in what we're trying to get through, we forget what the other side is looking for. And even if fear drives some of our decisions, that's fine. This bill passed with an element of fear and some amount of, I'm sure, energy by Senator Kennedy to convince Senator Barrasso that this was the right bill to get through at the right time. And it wasn't its first attempt. It wasn't even its third attempt. This was its fourth attempt. So the fact that it did get through, I think we could probably spend hours, if not days, talking about how that process happened. But it's very interesting. Now,
stepping back just a little, Fran had another question about what you said about venting earlier. Does the inability to destroy so they are vented statement apply to the entire world or the three areas shown on the screen? That would be the United States, European Union, and China.
They're the three biggest.
Yeah.
So there's only two countries in the world, well, three really, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and they have a destruction program in place. When you buy a pound of refrigerant, you pay a deposit, and then when you return that pound of refrigerant, you get your deposit back. The government uses any of the missing deposit money, which would be the leaked refrigerant, to fund destruction of refrigerants. And I could spend hours just on this topic. It's part of our regular work world. But destruction is the only way to be certain that these materials don't get vented. So, and Fran, we're just about to talk about you. So that's good timing. And Fran mentioned a minute ago that he was very involved in solar, but what Fran didn't mention is, as part of the pollution detectives, you're allowed to borrow equipment from Fran to help find leaks at your campus, in buildings, in restaurants, in supermarkets, and you can even escalate that and get a better visual camera, and you can engage with campus staff in the process. One of the things we're doing with Fran sometime the next 30-45 days is grocery stores that are in. Now, Fran's out of North Carolina, and I'm going to let Fran tell the story, but Fran's a pretty humble guy. He doesn't go into too much detail, but Fran has put together this nonprofit to help get these devices out. And believe it or not, there's a lot of people that want Fran's help in getting bodies in to help do leak testing. So we've got some pretty exciting things we're doing. And one of them is with a grocery store in North Carolina called Harris Teeter. And Harris Teeter wants Fran's help in getting leak detectors and bodies into stores to help do leak inspections and find leaks. So Fran, I'll let you explain the rest.
We started the pollution detectives 4 years ago with the insight that modern electronic equipment was now able to be used by untrained professionals as long as they got some coaching. And we started checking for pollutants in water and pseudoestrogens and a number of things, and quickly moved towards the schools sector of the economy, because 1 in 5 Americans either goes to or teaches at or works at a K through 12 school. And I thought if we could come up with some protocols and some tools that we could loan to science teachers or environmental teachers and actually have the kids feel like they could do some good, that it would, maybe we'd get Boy Scouts to make merit badges or things like that. So we started doing testing for lead in the drinking water. That's the middle monitor you see on your screen with a hand. And students can go and do high level testing, very sophisticated testing, better than federal regulation, for $5 a test, when if you outsource the testing to a certified lab, it's $50. So the schools now use this equipment to screen, and then if they uncover something that's really troubling, they spend the $50 so they can defend themselves. And so we started to do indoor air quality and found out that 40% of all schools in America will lower learning 1 letter grade, and another 10%, the indoor quality will lower learning 2 letter grades. And most of those schools are older and in poor or minority neighborhoods. So it becomes a social justice issue. And we're now looking for teachers and students to borrow our equipment. We have protocols written and so forth. You see the background to the slide you see is our webpage, and I would invite you all to go there.
Yeah, and we're happy to connect anybody that needs help connecting. I can tell you that the work that Fran's doing is making its way into areas of the country that I don't know that, Fran, you expected it when we started, or you started. But even groups like the EIA, who have a special program where they go in and they go out and canvass grocery stores and do leak checks in grocery stores, some of them undercover, some of them with the grocery store. They're really interested in the pollution detectives as a solution to get devices into people's hands. Because unlike any other big issue, this doesn't cost any money to find these problems and start investigating the source. Leaks are fixable. You don't have to replace a whole system to fix a leak. And so the work, Fran, that you're doing will put tools in people's hands that will help facilitate that.
And one of the things that I'm learning about, I'm new to this subject area. We have known for a long time that when students do the investigative work and then show it at science fairs or to a PTA, you galvanize the local community and they feel empowered. Climate change is a staggering psychological issue because everybody feels so out of control that they can't do anything. But if you have a kid go check your home air conditioning and say, hey, Dad, look at this, it becomes something that people can manage. And so I'm working on trying to expand the grassroots education so that kids get the science education while meeting their need to do good.
And we have some video, Ted, I don't know if you want to show that or share it later on, of some of the students surreptitiously doing their testing.
I don't have any video on this.
Okay. The video we saw the other day that shows the students putting the device into the freezer at the grocery store.
I don't have it as part of the presentation or the discussion,
okay.
but
We'd
it's
have to call it up.
easy to share with anybody afterward. There is
We'll
a
do
program called Green America, and they formed together with EIA to do on-site store audits. So they're going grocery store to grocery store, and they're taking these leak detectors and they're putting them in the cabinets, and they're finding leaks. And they did 54 locations, and 27 of the locations had an active leak. And to find an active leak is significant. It means these materials had to have leaked a significant amount of material. So this refrigerant is actually working its way through grocery stores. And of course, we're picking on grocery stores a little, but this is happening in hospitals, data centers. There's no place that's immune to these leaks. What happens is we just don't have a workforce big enough to do all the leak testing that's needed. There are roughly 100 million odd systems in function, in operation in the US, and there's only 250,000 service technicians. The average age of a piece of equipment is roughly 19 years old, and equipment typically starts to leak around its 7th year. So with all this leaking going on, what normally happens is people wait until a leak causes a unit to turn off or stop cooling, butter gets warm, ice cream melts, data centers shut down. We just experienced it today. Our data center is run by Microsoft in California, and a section of that data center went down today because they had a cooling problem. I'll guarantee you it was a leak. And so what happens is we wait until failure to find these leaks, and there are alternatives to that, and that's what Fran offers here through the pollution detectives. And I guarantee you, Fran will never run out of equipment.
That's true.
I'm telling you,
good source for equipment.
No, there are groups that are now interested in helping Fran get access to resources to make sure that this continues to be an available resource to anybody who wants it.
So Ted, what causes leaks after 7 years or so?
These are little chemical sets. Refrigerants are a chemical. They react negatively to water and air. Water and air are everywhere. A little bit of water in a system, a little bit of air causes refrigerants to break down at high temperature. Compressors get very hot in the summer. As the refrigerants break down, they create hydrofluoric acid, HF. That HF will deposit itself into nooks and crannies throughout the air conditioning or refrigeration system. Typically, two elements that are very malleable, very susceptible to HF are copper and aluminum. And we use solder, like it's a light silver, heavy aluminum compound. It comes on a wire. You use it to hold two pieces of copper together. And that's a very weak joint once HF hits it. And you don't need a lot of hydrofluoric acid to start creating pitting. And that's what's happening on the inside. On the outside, companies have determined or found out that the closer an appliance is to the edge of a building where there's traffic, the higher the likelihood of a leak before the 7th year.
Specifically automobile traffic?
Yep, exactly.
Carbon monoxide?
A combination of road pollution, let's call it.
Salt and everything else that comes from it. Interesting. So it somehow seeps onto the surface and does its work there.
Apparently it's in the air. It's so important that many retail operations have figured this out, and they're moving their air conditioning units closer to parking lots or grassy areas at the back, away from highways.
Wow. Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
So in schools, a lot of times the air conditioning units are parked right next to where the school buses sit with their engines running.
Oops.
Yep. Another great example. My eyes were opened to this by a company called Target. They don't name a really big name. Everybody knows Target. And Target, one of the engineers about 7 years ago started to explain to me that the average piece of equipment near the highway would last about 3 years, whereas the average piece of equipment away from the highway, only another 150 feet away, closer to, let's say, the parking lot or the green area at the back of the building, would last 7.
So the takeaway is you don't live right next to a highway.
Well, that's one of the takeaways, yeah. And the other takeaway is get these leak detectors out there, because even if you think an appliance is new, or you assume that somebody's doing some quarterly maintenance, you're likely wrong. They're overwhelmed. Campuses are a great example of the challenge that that maintenance teams have in getting quarterly inspections on appliances. One of the biggest challenges that any institution has in determining their refrigerant leaks throughout the year is knowing how many pounds of refrigerant they have on campus. Many of them don't know. They make guesses. They have no idea. We work with college campuses every day, and we're constantly revising their installed capacity as a result of site audits, reviews. We had some great success with a college up in New York, Colby College, and Colby had never reported refrigerant emissions. It took them over a year to get their refrigerant inventory calculated because they had to get some help from students who ultimately went out and recorded the size and shape of every one of the units that they owned. And that only just
to me, there's an opportunity there again for the students on the call. I can imagine if this doesn't already exist, that there'd be a real value in a student-led effort to induce campuses around the country to include refrigerant losses in their carbon footprints, maybe even a dirty dozen list or a ranking of some sort of those based on their refrigerant emissions and based on their refrigerant response activities. It just seems to me that this is an area where you've got environmental groups at the undergraduate and graduate and professional levels all around these universities. They care about these issues. Universities are moving in the right direction, but often not quickly enough and often ignoring this particular type of problem. So it just seems to me that a real opportunity here is a collective effort among environmental groups at the student level on the transparency side.
Mike, that's a great idea. Ted, do we have or can we develop a guide for the students, as Mike just suggested, questions to ask, criteria to follow, even in a forum situation?
Yeah, we're going to get to that. Give me 2 minutes and we're going to get there. All right, let me tell you. We'll go down here. We'll jump to this. I don't know if you guys have heard of this group. It's called Second Nature. Is anyone here aware of them?
No.
Second Nature is a nonprofit group that helps campuses establish their sustainability boundaries and do their sustainability audits. And they coach campus staff on how to do the work themselves. So campuses can run a do-it-yourself sustainability tracking program. And we've brought refrigerants to Second Nature, who's been tracking them. But after a brief evaluation, it was determined that roughly 50% of campuses report some level of refrigerant emissions, largely underreporting in almost every case. I won't say every case, but in almost every case. So the 50% that are reporting are still underreporting. Second Nature, we're working with them right now on a program to help empower student groups on campus participate in helping the campus gain visibility to their carbon footprint related to refrigerants. So this is brand new. As a matter of fact, it's so new. We were trying to work with an original group of Second Nature participating campuses to help them establish their inventory. And we're using those examples. It didn't go very quickly. It took a while, but we're using those examples to, let's say, build a training program that they can scale with. It doesn't cost anything. Once the campuses are already participating in Second Nature, all they have to do is get hold of this inventory, let's call it asset registry process, and it's off to the races after that. It's a real eye-opening event. It's like a scavenger hunt for equipment on campus. And campuses are unique because they have multiple budget buckets that they work from. So you might have a research building that's doing, some type of government research, and their funding might come from that government research until the project's over, and then it turns back over to the campus. But the campus doesn't have a list of that inventory because they were never part of the funding for it. So there are a lot of very interesting dynamic problems. One of the other things that's happening on campuses are the campus doesn't own the dorms, but they're responsible for them. So another contractor owns the dorms, but doesn't report that they've installed equipment. And so the campus may actually be responsible for the maintenance for that equipment, but there's no budget money for that maintenance because when the dorm was built, it was assumed that these new units wouldn't need maintenance. Under Scope 1 emissions, you're supposed to report your hydrocarbon use for the site. It could be for heat or electricity. And you're also supposed to report your fugitive emissions from refrigerants. So there's a requirement that this reporting takes place, but there's often a lack of connectivity between sustainability and reporting people and the operations people that have control over the information. And the student groups that we're working with are the ones that are creating that bridge and an awareness between the two groups. And all we're doing is just providing the material to help facilitate that. And this is really one of those kickoff discussions, because where we've tried it, we know it's worked. And so why not scale it everywhere? Does anyone have any questions about Second Nature? It's a really fascinating group based out of Boston. They work with about 400 campuses in the US. They're, as I said before, they're not-for-profit. A lot of activism in this group.
We have a
And I've got a
question.
couple of my students on the phone. What, if they're listening in, looking at your slides, what would they do if what they wanted to do was to get Vanderbilt to be upgrading the extent to which it's assessing, disclosing, and reducing refrigerant emissions?
Yeah, let me let me answer that question, but let me get to one last piece of this puzzle, if that's okay.
Sure.
And that's destruction of refrigerants. So if there are certain types of refrigerants that can be destroyed and carbon credits can be generated from these offsets. Offsets are basically a tool of liquidity in cap and trade markets. California has a cap and trade market. And so refrigerants collected in any state are applicable to the cap for offsets. And so if we find refrigerants or you find refrigerants, Rotary has set up a program where certain refrigerants, CFCs in particular, will be destroyed. Those destroyed refrigerants will generate offset credits. Those credits can then be used for education, training, better awareness on campus. But because Rotary is a nonprofit, again, all of this money is not being distributed to shareholders. It's really being distributed back into the marketplace where it can have the most positive impact. So remember, if it's not vented, it's destroyed. The Rotary project is actually one of the 4 projects that Rotary is bringing to COP26 next month. And that's why I wanted to mention this as I jump into the next topic. COP26 will heavily impact all of our future here, but also the future of refrigerants everywhere. And already we're seeing lead up meetings to COP26. COP26, to get a ticket is near impossible. So everybody's participating in grassroots programs so that they can have some contribution towards the solution that's going to be considered, voted on, ratified, hopefully. And the Rotary project for destroying refrigerants is one of those promising opportunities where it's a win across the board. We mentioned it earlier. The refrigerants have a value. And so if we can extract the value and reuse and repurpose that money for education and awareness, it can really be additive. So how does this all come back together? Well, I don't know why I threw that in there, but I like this Robert Swan quote. Let's see. Did you put it in here, Ray? You didn't put it in here. All right. So
What's that?
there are 3 ways to get involved right away. Number one, there are Rotaract groups on campus and I know at Vanderbilt there's a Rotaract group. Actually, there's a Rotaract group that participates on campus at Vanderbilt. And then there are Rotary groups around the country that are sponsoring Rotaract groups. Now, these Rotaract groups, they're a group, if anybody on this call part of Rotaract before I explain it? Let me check. I see one little question in the chat. Let me answer Taylor's question before I jump into Rotaract. Taylor,
You got that. Okay, good.
The only visible sign that refrigerants have leaked, because these are high pressure materials, is that the system will stop cooling what it was intended to cool. Once that happens, the refrigerants have all primarily leaked and you're left with having to recharge new refrigerants into the system. If it's a warm day in the south, unfortunately, what will happen is they will charge refrigerant into the system before looking for the leak. That way, at least it will be cooling the people who are part of, impacted by the unit shutting off. The bad thing about that is it's probably going to leak a significant amount of that refrigerant before they find the leak. That's why we leak 600 million pounds a year.
Ted, I assume that if it were possible to either make refrigerants have color or to make them smell, that would have been done by now, because it's such an obvious way to solve the problem.
Yeah, exactly. The color thing is hard because there's nothing suspended in the refrigerants can't suspend another solution. As they vent, they just vent clear like natural gas. Then there's the opportunity to put something in the refrigerants to make it smell, but then that also leads to further decay of the refrigerants and causes other chemical problems. There's a bunch of books and processes out there about how this entire thing is, led to failure where we are. Even the new refrigerants have the potential of creating localized acid rain. I'm pretty sure everybody on this call is younger than me, and acid rain was an issue that we fought against in the early 80s. So it's funny to see it back again this way through refrigerants. And I don't mean funny in a good way, but in an ironic way. Now, getting involved. If you're part of a group already, then the groups can reach out, whether it's for a leak detector, refrigerant destruction, or a process for helping the campus get their asset registry together. We've been really effective at getting in touch with campuses on behalf of students. We had a great conversation with LSU. We talked to University of California, several of their institutions, as well as New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. Some campus groups are more involved, are more interested in the solution than others. If you're, as I started to say, if you're in a Rotaract group, Rotaract is like a college-based Rotary group. Rotary is the group that's sponsoring the refrigerant destruction program. We can funnel all the information to the Rotaract group and make sure that you get the information that you need. But if you're doing this yourself and you want to get involved, you can reach out to us. We're facilitating all of the information. Now, I think that's going to change over time. We're looking for groups to take an active role, and EIA has mentioned a very deep interest in helping facilitate the information flow, acting as a hub for this. But we're doing it in the meantime until that gets off the ground. and we wouldn't let anybody down in that process. And then secondly, second nature, if they find out that there's a campus group or interested person on campus, they can connect with the chancellor's office, believe it or not, which is where most of their involvement is, and get the right people at the campus connected to you. Mike, does that answer that question?
Yes, it does. I guess, at Vanderbilt, our vice chancellor, Eric Kopstein, is very engaged on climate. We've entered into a power purchase agreement equal to all of the electricity we buy, so we can go carbon neutral on electricity. But it seems likely to me that we still have a lot of refrigerant issues. I don't know that for sure. So it's just interesting that, that it's not as simple as the top management being interested in solving the problem. It seems as though there's something more there. And it also seems here that we have a big medical center. And a question for you is, I'm assuming that the medical centers are a large target of opportunity here as well, not only at Vandy, but elsewhere around the country.
Yeah, hospital groups act very differently than everywhere else. They have their own governance. They tend to be they tend not to have a sustainability resource that's there to help. So hospitals, medical centers, really tough. Campuses have a high level of activism, so we see a lot of interest. But then operationally, the groups of people that are supporting the campus, maintaining the campus, usually have a very different attitude about things than the intellectual powers that are suggesting. And that's why in working with Second Nature, the idea is to get to as many of these campus chancellors, or that office, to take that hurdle away.
And something that would really get their attention, again, is if student groups on their own started ranking universities based on their refrigerant emissions and efforts to try to reduce them. I can't imagine a quicker way to get the chancellor's attention than a newspaper article that says you're ranked X among refrigerants. And sometimes it takes that kind of effort. I would say that a bunch of us are also working with various physicians and administrators in medical centers around the country, trying to accelerate the process of medical centers decarbonizing. And a lot of that is being driven by the fact that medical school applicants, resident applicants, and lateral hires, both retention and recruitment, are largely more and more focused on climate, more so than the more senior docs. And we're seeing that as a driving force for medical centers around the country. I have an article coming out in the Journal of the American College of Radiology shortly, and another article in the works, both focusing on efforts underway to try to decarbonize medical centers, despite a lot of the resistance that you mentioned, which is quite a bit greater than we see on college campuses, but they're not immune to it. And it seems to me that it's largely going to be on the recruitment and retention side that they begin to start looking around and realizing they could actually save money and do the right thing at the same time.
Well, it may not seem like, if you're new to this level of activism, that it can have an impact at higher levels. But I'll tell you that last year, when the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act was going through its adjustment period and review, and everybody was contributing, it was the grassroots groups that led to the EPA getting two things. And these two things are the centerpiece of what's making this bill so effective. One, the EPA needed authority over maintenance practices. That was not anywhere near this bill up until December. And as the bill started to get closer, there were a whole group of climate-related groups referred to as 350.org, could be 350 NYC, it could be 350 Miami, but these groups banded together. We had nightly meetings for about 3 weeks. It was intense. And we all got the same message to the members of Congress that were in our jurisdiction, or were in the right jurisdiction. And with this group, we changed two things in this bill. We got the We got the EPA the authority they needed to maintain certain maintenance practices. So that will lead to fewer leaks. That's number one. And number two, we got the EPA to ban disposable cylinders. Those things were not lobbied for by the big companies. That was lobbied for by a real grassroots organization. So it was a victory for the grassroots movement to be able to get these two issues on the table. And they're two of the three things that happened.
That's great to hear. And again, it's a story the students need to hear more widely. Another good reason for someone to do a widely circulated paper on this, showing that activity.
Yeah, it was very exciting. That's why, we'll continue to do these. Fran and I meet. We have a group that we participate in, which is, and I'm not a Peace Corps worker, but we met at this group. It's called Return Peace Corps Workers, and it's a fantastic group. And I would meet with the 350 NYC group and other 350 groups around the country. And this level of activism is the only way to build substantial change. Every other way is too intermittent, but this way works.
Which is probably a good time to wrap things up unless other people have questions. I noticed that Steve is with us. Steve, can you hear me? Do you want to introduce yourself? Welcome. Well, it shows he's here.
May never get him to talk.
May never get him to talk. He's still undercover somewhere. I just want to mention that in the chat section, you'll see that I posted a link to the a handout. It's about 7 pages long, covers a lot of what we spoke about here today, goes into the history very briefly of refrigerants, some background links that you can check out for more research, and then obviously some ways to get involved and take action, and with our contact information at the end. So that's a good document if you're going to write a paper, if you're going to start something on a campus, if you're going to start testing on your own, whatever you'd like to do. This document that I just posted is a very good starting place, and then contact us with any questions you might have.
Yeah, and anyone who needs any additional information, you've got our email, so reach out, and we'll connect the dots and network for you so you can get engaged, and we'll support you through the process.
Absolutely. And Steve, I noticed your message in the chat that you're having technical difficulties. No problem. We'll catch you next time. And you and I actually are connected through a Mexican farm project you worked on with Anthony Cagiola. So we'll talk about that. It's a very, very small world. With that, does anyone else have any other questions? This is your last chance for this conversation.
Well,
all right.
Guys, Mike, thank you. Thanks
thank you so much.
Participating. Really appreciate your input. I owe you some materials. I'll make sure I get them to you.
That sounds great, and good luck to you all with this project. And I hope it leads to some students getting engaged on this.
Oh, we hope so too. That's the only way it's going to happen. Thank you, Mike.
Great. All right.
All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great night, and thank you for attending and listening.
Bye, guys. Have a great night.